The Rspb's Hesketh Outmarsh is an exciting new nature reserve on the Ribble Estuary in Lancashire. Visitors can already see an impressive variety of birds in this rare coastal habitat.
Good morning, everyone. Someone in, have a look from the platform.
Hesketh Outmarsh has been made from farmland that has been turned back to the way it originally was, which is salt marsh, land that is occasionally covered by only the highest tides. Recreating natural landscapes like this is important work for the Rspb, as site manager Tony Baker explains.
Salt marshes are, I think they're the engine room really of the estuary ecosystem. Without them, the estuary simply wouldn't function properly, and without them we would lose thousands of the birds that depend upon important estuaries around the coast.
But salt marshes are under threat from a combination of a rising sea level and human development that is happening all along our coast. In fact, many of Britain's valuable salt marshes have already been lost.
We're losing salt marsh, and we're losing about 100 hectares of salt marsh every year. That means we've got to try and replace that salt marsh with new salt marshes wherever we can.
The Ribble Estuary is a perfect spot. It's here that the River Ribble, full of nutrients, flows into the warm, sheltered waters of the Irish Sea. It's also on a major bird migration route, and every winter you'll find the highest numbers of birds here of any estuary in the UK. This project took off when it was realised that restoring the salt marsh here would meet a number of urgent needs. The Environment Agency is responsible for managing flood risk from rivers and the sea, and needed to carry out improvements to sea defences in this area. So they jumped at the chance to work with the Rspb, together with Natural England and Lancaster City Council. The project would unite a number of objectives. New flood embankments would protect the inland area, and a new salt marsh would provide a buffer zone for floodwater as well as an excellent habitat for wildlife. The marsh would also join similar sites around the estuary to be part of the new Ribble Coast and Wetlands Regional Park. This land used to be salt marsh until the 1970s, when a new outer seawall was built to create an area of arable farmland. The Rspb bought the western end in 2006. Engineering consultants Halcrow produced computer models to show how the restoration scheme would work. They suggested that a series of new creeks be dug in the marsh, following the pattern that used to exist. The soil dug from the new creeks would then be used to make a new flood embankment behind the marsh. This would save the Environment Agency bringing in the material they needed by road, which would be very expensive and have a serious impact on the local environment, roads and villages. Finally, 4 wide breaches would be made in the outer wall linking to the new creeks. The creeks would fill and empty at every tide, but on the highest tides, in spring and autumn, almost all the reserve would be submerged in seawater. This is pretty much how the salt marsh used to be, but the Rspb used a bit of creative license to add some special features that the birds and the birdwatchers would appreciate.
Yeah, it's not entirely natural, you could say, and of course we've cheated a bit by adding some new lagoons which are close to the sea wall, so you can see them quite easily from the footpath.
The earthworks have taken 2 years to complete, and they can now be put to the test by opening up the seawall and letting the tide come in. Early in 2009, a particularly high spring tide arrives. The result is spectacular. Seawater pours through the new opening and into the new creeks, which quickly fill. As the tide continues to rise ever higher, seawater spills out onto the old farmland. At the peak of the tide, almost the whole of the Hesketh Outmarsh is under salt water, the first time in 30 years. There's salt water covering the land as far as the eye can see. Then, after an hour, the tide turns and water pours furiously back out to sea through the new gaps in the seawall. Over the next months, seawater is brought in and out of the site on every tide. The initial effect actually looks rather a mess. The salt water kills off all the farmland weeds and grass, which turn brown and decompose.
Yeah, it's not going to look particularly nice for a little while, and it might even smell a little bit unpleasant for a while. But yeah, it's good news, because given that we're going into the spring now, it should mean that we get a new type of vegetation coming through.
Floating in the water from each tide are masses of seeds from plants that can survive in salty conditions. These will germinate and grow into a whole new ecosystem of plants and animals. And it is these that provide the unique coastal habitat that birds really love. This process is being studied by scientists from nearby Edgehill University, led by the husband and wife team of Alan and Hilary Bedford.
Well, what we're doing is we're monitoring the changes. So we've been asked to actually look at some key parts of the system. So we're going to be monitoring the plants and looking at the change from this basically weed community, which was on the agricultural land, and look to see how quickly it changes back to proper salt marsh, because that's going to determine how many birds can actually use this as an important reserve.
The early signs of this transformation are already there. They find small plants of atriplex or spear-leaved orache, which produce loads of seeds, and puccinalia, the seagrass that ducks and geese love to eat. They also find the fleshy leaf Sueda maritima, or sea blight, and just begin to sprout is some salicornia, or samphire, enjoyed by birds and also by us humans as a kind of salty asparagus.
And what we're expecting is that around the edges of the lagoons and in the areas where the seas come in, we all expect to get a proper salt marsh community developing. Hopefully by next year there will be a lot more to see than there is at the moment.
The scientists are studying the animals and fish that are starting to move in as well, particularly the ones that birds feed on. A key piece of apparatus is the simple but effective dustbin sampler.
What the dustbin sampler does, it's just a cylinder that goes down into the water, traps the animals. You then draw a net underneath, so when you lift the whole thing up, any animals living in the water are just trapped on that net.
Samples from the water and from the surrounding mud are taken back to the university to be examined. Already there is lots of new life in the marsh.
There are key species we're interested in, like the little sandhopper Crophium volutator, which is phenomenal because it's present in such enormous numbers for many of the waders, particularly the ones with short bills, like the red shank. They're just looking for the slight movement, and they just pick them up, and they eat thousands and thousands per day.
By early summer, as the breeding season gets underway, the changing environment at Escathout Marsh is clearly to the birds' liking. Red shanks begin courtship, and their cries can be heard all over the estuary. Oyster catchers are distinctive with their black and white plumage and red bills. They arrive at Hesketh, and so do avocets. And it is particularly exciting when several avocets build nests on the spits of land on the new lagoons. Lapwings, now scarce in many parts of Britain, arrive in good numbers, performing courtship flights over the marsh. Shelducks make themselves at home on the new lagoons, but the main arrival of ducks and geese is expected in the autumn. Herons move in, following the fish that are attracted to this new habitat. So too do little egrets, newcomers to these parts, making their way north as our climate warms up. Other creatures find their way onto the site, such as hares. They sometimes get cut off by the tide, but they are good swimmers. As summer gives way to autumn, the skies over the Ribble estuary fill with some of our most spectacular visitors, the migratory ducks and geese that come south for winter. Pink-footed geese fly over in formation. Large Canada geese join them on the ground. There are many types of duck here too. Teal, pintails, widgeons and shovelers. Black-tailed godwits probe the ground for food, as do curlews with their distinctive curved bills. Vast flocks of birds spend their winter here, attracted by the plentiful food. So throughout the first year, there has been plenty for visitors to see. And Ribble site warden Graham Clarkson shows them round.
Yeah, look over. If you look at the trees, I bet you will spot some avocets. And that's actually doing a really interesting thing there. It's what you call scythe feeding. It's filter feeding through the mud, and it moves its head side to side.
Hesketh Marsh has lots on offer if you want to come and visit. The viewing platform next to the footpath is a great place for bird watching. There's something for everyone here.
I think we'll get a range of people. We'll get the hardened bird enthusiasts who'll come in all weathers looking for all kinds of species. We'll get people who just want a nice quiet afternoon out. We'll of course have ramblers, we'll have dog walkers, and we'll have people that just want to get closer to nature in a quiet, thoughtful way.
The Hesketh Marsh Reserve has been several years in the planning, and the change from farmland to salt marsh will take time to complete. But the first results are pretty impressive.
It's already been a great success, and we've seen the salt marsh developing really quite quickly. We've had the important birds that we were hoping to attract, the redshanks and the avocets, have already nested on the site, and now we're getting the wintering waterfowl coming in their thousands. This is what the Rspb does best. It's working all across the country to restore this kind of habitat so that our children and their children will be able to enjoy the same range of wildlife into the future.